Australia, an ocean continent renowned for its endless coastline and vast interior. Travelling the country can mean journeys that are long, challenging, and sometimes disastrous. In this episode, disasters on the highways, the railways, and in the air.
We're on fire.
Just a warning, something is seriously wrong.
Stories of catastrophe.
I knew we were gone.
And courage.
It's come straight down on a carriage here. Most of the carriage is underneath the bridge here.
How we got out, God only knows.
As we witness the desperation, the heartache,
And there's a little girl around the other side, she's dead.
and the heroes on Savage Australia, Fatal Journeys. Of all the countries on Earth surrounded by sea, Australia is the largest. Its landmass is 50% greater than all of Europe combined. The harbour city of Sydney is a 16,000 kilometre flight away from Europe. Almost 3,000 kilometres from Uluru in the heartland, and over 1,000 kilometres away from the Great Barrier Reef. These distances mean a massive transport network, over 820,000 kilometres of road, black ribbons of seemingly endless highway, and dusty dirt tracks that crisscross the land. And it's the same with the steel highways. Some 30,000 kilometres of track traverse the continent. Australia was the last of the habitable continents to be colonised by Europeans. Her destiny was shaped by the tyranny of distance, both from the colonisers' homelands and between our own coastlines. The population concentrated at the fringes of the continent, creating capital cities hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometres apart. Soon after settlement, the new colonials realised they'd need to head west to grow food and graze livestock. As distances between farming towns and cities grew, so did the need for automated transport. From the mid-1800s, it was the steam trains that began to meet the ever-growing needs of Australian passenger travel and commerce.
This train, travelling through nature's ramparts, descends eventually to open country after dragging its black load over mountains nearly 4,000 feet high.
The movement of coal became a driving force behind extending the great rail highways. The increase in rail and rolling stock throughout the states signalled the end of isolation and the beginning of Australia's history of fatal journeys. In 1908, the country town of Sunshine became the site of Victoria's most deadly train crash. On a fine Easter Monday, two trains packed with holidaymakers collided at the station. The impact tore the carriage apart, taking the lives of 44 men, women and children and injuring over 400 passengers. There were disasters on city trains too, like this one, just out of Melbourne.
On July 18, 1910, in foggy conditions, an incoming commuter train collided with a stationary locomotive. 9 people were killed and more than 100 injured.
But there'd be no stopping progress. Locos were already full steam ahead.
Australia's first streamlined train helping to celebrate South Australia's centenary.
As trains moved from steam to electric, and simple tracks turned into massive networks with hundreds of trains needing to switch tracks, the risk of collisions increased. So too did the efforts to prevent further disaster. Teams of railwaymen were trained in signalling, switching, and keeping track of train movements to avert the potential of head-ons. But with such vast and ever-growing networks, and so many train movements to and from the major cities, collisions were inevitable. Miraculously, only minor injuries occurred in these train crashes just outside Sydney in the 1930s and early 40s.
Passengers were again lucky to escape death in January 1945 when this train came around a bend near Maryland Station in Sydney's west, heading for the city at 65 kilometres an hour and struck a 17-centimetre bolt which had been placed lengthwise on the rail. Boys were thought to have placed the bolt on the line, and with more than 200 people on board, it was a miracle that no one was killed.
But as the number of rail passengers grew, that was set to change. The Southern Aurora's journey from Melbourne to Sydney in 1962 was heralded as a new era in train travel.
Crossing the Murray River, the border between New South Wales and Victoria, the Southern Aurora proceeded along the existing standard gauge line to Wodonga, the commencing point of the new standard gauge line.
Two powerful 1,800 horsepower diesel locomotives pulled 14 luxurious stainless steel carriages. The first direct passenger train between Australia's two major cities drew crowds of excited onlookers. The scenic journey of almost 1,000 kilometres took passengers through stunning and isolated countryside. But less than 10 years after the Southern Aurora's inaugural journey, disaster struck 174 kilometres north of Melbourne in Violet Town. Just after 7 a.m. on the 7th of February 1969, the Southern Aurora crashed head-on with a fast freight train at an estimated speed of some 172 kilometres per hour. 8 of the Southern Aurora's 14 cars were derailed, 9 people were killed, and more than 50 injured.
Unfortunately, there were many others that were just not as fortunate as us.
The toll could have been much higher. Shortly after the crash, fire swept through the carriages.
Many of the 600 residents of Violet Town rushed to the scene of the devastation, using any means they could to help the rescue mission. It would later be revealed that the driver of the Aurora suffered a heart attack, missing the signal to move on to a loop track and leaving the train speeding on a collision course. A terrible tragedy, but dwarfed by what was to come. On the morning of Tuesday, January 18th, 1977, just like every other workday, thousands of people commuted from outer townships into Sydney. Passengers on the 6:09 a.m. commuter train from the Blue Mountains, 100 kilometres west of Sydney, expected to reach the city just after 8:30 a.m. By the time the 6:09 was nearing Granville, the 8 timber carriages were packed with over 400 passengers. But at 8:10 a.m, as the train, travelling at 75 kilometres an hour, took a left-hand curve towards the station, the engine derailed. The train collided with one of 2 stanchions holding up the concrete bridge above. Within seconds, the bridge crashed down onto the carriages below. The aftermath was one of absolute horror.
There's just bodies everywhere. Everywhere. I thought it was just the carriage under the bridge at first, but then I had a look on the other side of the bridge at the locomotive's on its side, and one carriage, all you can see is the floor of it. It's on its side. It had the top ripped off it.
It appears that the back end of our carriage hit the remaining part of the staunch, bringing the bridge down, which happened 5 seconds. It's very hard to estimate time. It's just a gap of time.
It's come straight down on a carriage here. Most of the carriage is underneath the bridge here.
The derailed first carriage, with 73 passengers on board, had been torn apart by a power pole.
She started to rock and then she went over and the front carriage split apart like a sardine tin. How we got out, God only knows.
Miraculously, The derailed second carriage remained upright, with all its occupants surviving. But for the passengers trapped beneath the bridge in carriages 3 and 4, there appeared to be little hope. It would become one of Australia's longest rescue and recovery operations ever. It was undertaken by teams of emergency workers, doctors, nurses, police officers, firefighters, railway workers and civilians, all who rushed to help. Within 20 minutes, there was some 1,500 people in the cutting, many risking their own lives to save the trapped and injured.
I was trapped under the bridge for the very end part of the bridge for about 2.5 hours. I was cramped up and my arm was over my chest and my head was half into the other seat where the other gentleman was. All I could hear was just saws above me or hammers or something trying to get the rubble off me.
The general public watched on in disbelief, wondering how such a massive tragedy could occur in a major metropolitan station. Panicked relatives desperately tried to find their missing loved ones.
Can I go and see? What makes you think there's somebody in there?
Well, it's the 8 o'clock train from Parramatta.
Yeah.
She always gets that train.
Who's that?
Jenny.
Your daughter?
Yes, and she hasn't arrived at work. Can't go down there.
Although it's too early to know the reason for this accident, it is grimly clear that safety procedures didn't work here today at Granville.
The injured began being stretchered from the rubble and ferried to ambulances. There were so many injured that 6 hospitals postponed standard operations and put emergency teams on standby to deal with the massive number of victims.
Inevitably, some of the victims were rescuers, like this ambulanceman overcome by butane gas while trying to treat some of the injured at the crash site. A number of other emergency personnel and firemen were also affected by the gas.
When police weren't overseeing operations at the site, they were running a high-speed shuttle service for urgently needed blood and medical supplies. Ice was ferried out to the accident scene for severed legs and amputations. The number of injured meant that there was a severe shortage of blood on reserve.
I'd like to tell you once again that the blood transfusion service in Sydney has made an urgent appeal for donors of all types of blood. I'll repeat that, all types of blood.
Within hours, as many as 500 people lined up at the blood bank headquarters offering blood for the train victims. So many volunteers turned up that some hospitals were unable to cope with the demand. Throughout the day, the casualties just kept coming, but at least they were free of the massive concrete and steel slab that still held so many trapped. By 1:30 that afternoon, 19 bodies had been recovered from a section of the 4th carriage. But to extract the living from the rubble would prove to be a long and desperate operation.
That slab of concrete, unbeknownst to the outside world, was continuously going down. Where you had someone trapped, eventually you lost another 2 inches in the space that you had to work.
As an increasing number of bodies were lifted from the wreckage, there were grave fears there could be many more.
As far as we know, there could be as many as 40 bodies trapped underneath the vast concrete span of the bridge which collapsed there over the train this morning. A doctor I was speaking to just a few minutes ago said he'd counted 20 bodies, and we just don't know how many there are.
When night fell, the search and rescue teams worked under lights in a desperate and seemingly hopeless bid to find any more survivors.
People who are still down there, there's very little hope that we will find any more alive. And I've been rescuing now 23 years, and this is the worst disaster, the worst scene that I've ever come across.
After 14 hours, they knew they could not help the 67 other victims still trapped, but they kept that knowledge to themselves as they called in more teams of jackhammers.
Eventually, the first slab of concrete was prized free. What lay underneath sickened those who had to look.
For veteran paramedic Paul Featherston, it was his first experience of a major disaster.
They finally got the roadway off, and there was a train on the track, and you could see the rows and rows of people.
The police have told us some quite horrifying stories about the people who remain in that wreckage. They remain frozen in the positions in which they were when they died, reading newspapers or with their arms out the window.
One by one, the bodies were extracted and carried 20 metres to a large tent, the local field morgue. For exhausted medical aides, it was now a matter of identification. It was only then that rescue workers, many of whom had laboured over 30 hours, had time to stop and think about the dangers they themselves had faced.
You're always in hope that when you lifted that bridge and you lifted that carriage top, that there may have been people alive under there, you know, with an air pocket or whatever. So in our professions, we never stop looking and hoping for people alive until they're all accounted for and we have what we have.
Even to this day, the 1977 Granville train disaster remains the most fatal rail journey in Australian history. 84 people died, more than 213 were injured, and thousands were affected by grief. Some of the worst train disasters have occurred on remote sections of railway, where trucks cross in front of an oncoming train. There are over 23,000 sites where rail and road intersect. Every one of them poses a deadly risk. One officer who's experienced the horrific aftermath of level crossing crashes is retired Senior Sergeant Jeff Smith.
In the time I was at the collision group, we investigated hundreds of collisions at level crossings, both in the country and in the city. 95% of the crashes that were happened at level crossings when I was there was driver error or sheer driver stupidity.
CCTV footage reveals a constant dice with death by impatient drivers who gamble their lives against the might and power of our biggest trains.
It's a train and a car. Who's going to win that one? And who's going to die? And it's usually the person who's made the mistake.
Things like that coming up is always a problem.
Many of Australia's level crossings are in the middle of nowhere. And 2/3 of them have no warning bells or boom gates. But even when they do, some drivers ignore them at their peril, and the result is utter carnage. In May 2006, a truck driver died when his vehicle, loaded with 30 tonnes of citrus pulp, collided with a massive freight train near the Victorian town of Lismore. 700 metres of carriages were compacted by the immense forces into a 150-metre long pyramid of twisted metal. Nearly 250,000 bottles of premium wine en route to Europe were shattered. Aside from the tragic human cost, the total damage of the bill from this one truck collision alone ran over $27 million. When a driver hits the emergency brake on a 1.5 kilometre freight train travelling at 100 kilometres an hour, it can take almost 2 kilometres for the train to stop.
1,266 metres it took, and I couldn't do it any faster. It just doesn't stop.
When the locomotive is hauling passengers rather than cargo, the aftermath of an impact can be catastrophic. In 2007, near the remote town of Kang in central Victoria, a truck and train collision resulted in the most horrific rail disaster since Granville.
I was at the collision group for 17 years, and in terms of just absolute carnage, that was the worst job I've ever seen, and nothing comes near it.
The front of the semi-trailer was squashed flat, its cargo strewn around the scene, but the damage to the train and its passengers was far more confronting. The train driver had done his best to avert the disaster.
He blew the horn a number of times, and he started to get concerned that the driver hadn't started to slow down. So at that stage, the driver's doing about 102 kilometres an hour, and that's roughly 40 metres a second. So he's got 10 seconds to wake up to the fact that the train's coming.
The semi-trailer braked too late, slamming into the side of the train and peeling carriages open like a sardine tin.
When we arrived, we could see straight away one of the carriages on its own, and it had a massive gouge out of the side. The other carriages were back near the actual intersection where the crossing was itself, and it had had the whole side ripped out.
It's horrible, just people screaming, you know, beside themselves. There's a dead woman in the first carriage that I had to get in and help get their gear out. And then the next carriage, it was just, horrible. There's that many dead people laying around and people dying.
Rescue workers were swift to arrive, setting up a triage and transporting dozens of injured passengers to hospital.
People were ripping looked like lining and seats out to get to injured because you could just hear the people that were underneath. They were under all the metal that was peeled back from the train.
But for many of the passengers, there was no hope.
The death toll from the Kang train disaster could rise today. Emergency crews have resumed the grim search for bodies, with 3 people still unaccounted for. 11 passengers have already been confirmed killed. 23 others remain in hospital.
After every disaster, there are investigations and new promises to increase safety at level crossings. But the carnage continues.
Mother of 4, Vanessa Carlson, had simply failed to stop.
In recent history, more than 100 incidents a year have occurred in country Victoria alone. With trains getting faster and more vehicles on the road, the potential for more fatal crashes looms large. There are now over 400,000 trucks on Australian roads. With the advent of the dash cam, we can see just how close to death many drivers come. But some defy all the odds. This is footage of a woman next to her car, seconds after colliding with a fallen tree.
You all right?
Suddenly, an out-of-control truck flies around the corner. It swerves to miss the other truck and heads straight for the woman.
I'm about to be killed. That's what went through my head.
The truck ploughed into her sedan, pushing it down the highway just seconds after she made it to safety. A dash cam in Sydney in 2014 captured a truck travelling so fast it's almost airborne. As it topples over cars stopped at the traffic lights. As the lights change, a pedestrian rushes across the road to help. No one could believe what had just happened on their regular daily commute.
My life flashed before my eyes. Yeah, it was just, it was shocking.
Rescue workers rushed to the scene and extracted the injured from the 7 crushed vehicles. Miraculously, there were no fatalities.
Everyone in that accident has actually walked away with no life-threatening injuries, and I just frankly can't believe it.
Even the driver of the runaway truck survived this horrendous accident. One of the busiest and most dangerous roads in Australia is the Pacific Highway on the east coast of New South Wales. It's known as the Black Ribbon of Death, an 800-kilometre stretch of road that's taken the lives of thousands of travellers. Up until the late 1990s, much of the road was undivided, adding to the risks and incidents of head-on collisions. With such great distances to traverse, many truck drivers choose to travel at night. It's a practice that likely contributed to a fatal collision on the 20th of October 1989 at Grafton. The nightmare locals had been predicting for years came at 4 a.m. on a straight stretch of the Pacific Highway.
It's believed the semi-trailer veered to the wrong side of the road, side-swiping the tourist bus and flipping it onto its side. The collision left bodies and debris strewn over half a kilometre.
We'll lift this bus and see if we can find any more.
The truck driver died instantly. So did 18 passengers who were torn from their seats when the semi ripped open the coach's right side.
As police set up a roadside morgue, rescuers worked desperately to free the injured, many of them children. With the crash so far from any major city, the seriously injured needed to be airlifted for treatment. Survivors spoke of being trapped under the weight of bodies. Many were asleep when the collision occurred.
All I can remember was this, it was the worst bang I'd ever heard. And then the next thing, there were people on top of me in metal and my head was squashed between 2 seats. I was just lucky, very, very lucky. And I prayed when I got out of that hole.
I was asleep at the time, I think. And when I woke up, I was outside the bus, wet and drenched in blood.
For the ambulance and police officers who responded to the call-out, the scene was confronting.
Well, I was at the Granville train disaster and the comparison between these 2 accidents was eerie.
On a road this narrow, it was impossible for the bus driver to avoid the semi, resulting in the death of 21 people and the injury of a further 22. Subsequent crash investigations revealed something all too common in the long-haul trucking industry.
We would analyse blood from truck drivers routinely, and routinely you would get amphetamines found in therapeutic levels, which means that at some stage probably the drivers had drugs in his system which weren't therapeutic levels, and when they come down to the level of a normal person, they have what's called a drop-off and they fall asleep and there's your crash.
Just 8 weeks after the horror of the Grafton bus crash, another collision 200 kilometres south on the same highway was the scene of yet another deadly road journey. A truck driver on the Pacific Highway at night saw a bus pass by.
And there was these girls on the left-hand side of the bus all give us a big wave and a cheer and a smile sort of thing as I went past, and I just pulled in behind him and followed him along.
But by the time he'd caught up to it, the bus had been destroyed. So soon after the horror of Grafton, an even worse road disaster seemed incomprehensible. At 3:30 a.m, just 3 days before Christmas, 2 coaches had slammed head-on at Clybucker Flat near Kempsey.
So severe was the collision, one bus speared through the front of the other. Rescuers found bodies littered through the wreckage.
The debris of seats, people and hand luggage was from the floor to the ceiling.
Priority was given to tending the survivors. Many of them were trapped and pleading for help.
In this situation, we just got to treat the greatest number of people. We had a fellow that stopped breathing over here. We just had to leave him. We couldn't resuscitate him.
The two buses bound for Sydney and Brisbane were packed with Christmas holiday makers. Their journeys cut tragically short when one of the coaches veered onto the wrong side of the narrow highway.
No doubt many of the passengers were heading for families to share with them for Christmas time. And to have this happen just sort of accentuates the tragedy.
Even for the most experienced police, the disaster was a terrible shock.
This is the most horrific accident that I've ever seen in 38 years in the police force.
By the time they dragged the coaches apart, the death toll had reached 35, with a further 41 injured. The only upside in the face of such a huge loss of life were demands to have Australian coaches fitted with seatbelts to help avoid other massive tragedies. But it would be years before those laws were implemented. In 1994, Boondall, an outer suburb of Brisbane, was the site of Queensland's deadliest bus crash. On a straight, modern stretch of divided road, a now all too familiar tragedy. A coachload of mostly retirees ended up on its side down a steep embankment. Before emergency workers reached the scene, members of the general public entered the wreck to find a nightmare.
There was just a mess of bodies, legs, limbs, all intertwined with each other and entwined with the seats. So we had to sort of untangle them and lay them out. Many were bleeding.
There's one lady I pulled out who had her arm severed right off just below the elbow. And there's a little girl around the other side, she's dead. And I think I brought another lady out, she'd die too.
And I think most people wonder whether they're going to be able to cope with what they actually see, because it's not like a movie, it's for real and something has to be done immediately.
While 25 ambulance crews rushed to treat the injured by the roadside and ferry them to hospitals, a makeshift morgue was set up for the 12 passengers who died. No one escaped injury. The elderly who did survive were shattered. For everyone at the scene, it was a trauma they'd be unlikely to recover from anytime soon.
They never get easier, and they're one of the types of incidents that we dread coming to.
Everyone there did their best to help others, including Beth, who was separated from her friend.
And she just put lipstick on her lips, and I turned to her and I said, "Oh, gee, you look pretty now." And then after she came and lay down on the grass beside me, and I said, "Now you're a bloody mess, aren't you?" She had blood in her hair, blood all over her face, and tried to make her laugh, but poor darling.
In the decade or so since these fatal road journeys, the dangerous black spot on the Pacific Highway has been bypassed. Most of the highway is now a divided road, and seatbelts are enshrined in law. But that's not necessarily the end of fatal journeys on Australian roads.
Who could believe that you'd have a bus without seatbelts in them? I mean, where on outer space does that come from, that you'd be driving around in a bus worth 400 grand and there was no seatbelts in them? Well, now that's changed. Things like that will stop, I hope, the big ticket crashes.
Air travel is an essential reality for most of the population. And international flights to Australia can be some of the longest in the world.
Here we come.
These long-haul flights are nothing compared to what they once were. In the 1930s, the journey from Sydney to London took 10 days, with 30 refuelling stops on what became known as the Kangaroo Route. What was conceived as a mail run evolved into the most exotic international travel imaginable. It marked a golden age of aviation for passengers who could afford the trip in luxurious Qantas Empire-class Catalina flying boats.
Up from the bay on full takeoff power. Flaps up and engines back to cruising speed for a single circuit.
But with the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Australian government put the flying boats into service with the Royal Australian Air Force. By 1944, all bar one had been destroyed. Since the very early days, there have been many journeys by air that have ended in tragedy.
As it attempted to land on that runway, apparently it crashed.
In the years between 2005 and 2014, 254 aircraft have been involved in fatal journeys, with 374 deaths.
One side of the popular shopping centre was torn open, intense flame, fuelled by aviation gas. The plane's tanks would have been full.
The newest addition to Australia's commercial airlines, the Fokker Friendship Able Tasman.
But it was in the 1960s when a Fokker Friendship went down, creating the country's worst commercial disaster. A TAA flight smashed into the sea at Mackay. It disappeared into the ocean along with all 29 on board.
Mackay today is a city in mourning.
The cause remains a mystery 56 years later. In another commercial air tragedy, a Transair flight that took off from far north Queensland in 2007 failed to reach its destination of Lockhart River. There were 13 passengers and 2 pilots on board.
We're still searching along the flight path to determine what may have happened to the aircraft, and we have had absolutely no indication of what may have happened at this point in time.
The following day, in rugged hills, just minutes from safety, the flaming, smouldering wreckage was found. Little was left. The plane left Bamaga on the tip of Cape York on a scheduled service flight to the Lockhart River. But just 11 kilometres north of the airstrip, it slammed into a mountainside and burst into flames. Conditions were poor, with cloud cover as low as 400 metres. They missed clearing the top of the mountain by 100 metres. All 15 people on board, including the 40-year-old captain, perished. As the decades rolled by, commercial planes became bigger, faster and safer. But even one of the world's safest airlines has had its incidents.
We're on fire.
In 2008, a huge hole was blown in the side of a Qantas jumbo when an oxygen cylinder exploded mid-air.
The paramedics and ambulance people into the aircraft.
That major incident was followed by another 3 months later. 100 passengers suffered injuries when a computer fault caused an Airbus A330 to nosedive more than 300 metres. An emergency landing was made in Western Australia, but worse was still to come. On the 4th of November 2010, another Qantas Airbus A380 carrying 469 passengers suffered an incredible 60 system failures. The captain, Richard de Crespigny, was a 25-year veteran of Qantas. Before that, he was a pilot in the Air Force. For him, what happened in 2010 was a once-in-a-lifetime event.
I don't think an Airbus aircraft has ever been challenged as much as this has. I think a Rolls-Royce engine's never failed so spectacularly.
Master warning, something is seriously wrong.
We heard a bang and we just passed off turbulence. Only 5 seconds later, we heard a louder bang, almost like a bomb sound. And then we saw smoke almost directly onto the left wing.
Slightly more stressful when the piece of wing at the front flew back across the top of the wing, back behind the plane. And I had an elderly couple beside me that I couldn't really say, hey, you should have seen that, that's not good.
QF-32 was only minutes into its flight out of Singapore, and unknown to anyone, there was a small oil leak in engine number 2. In the super-hot engine, the oil ignited. Within seconds, one of the 160-kilo turbine discs exploded at incredibly high speed. 2 pieces smashed through the wing, severing the plane's controls, while a third did the same underneath the plane.
Engine number 2, overheat and failure. Engines 1 and 4 degraded 2 levels in thrust. Electrically, the left-hand side of the aircraft was dead. We lost 50% of the hydraulic systems. The brakes underneath the wings were reduced to 30% braking efficiency, and anti-skid was inoperative. Fuel system, 3 tanks out of 11 functioned. No transfer system was available. No jettison system was available. We had multiple holes in the wing, which disrupted the airflow over the wing and caused the stall speed to increase.
Modern aircraft automatically send data to the engineers on the ground in real time, so the drama in the sky was frantically being tracked back in Sydney.
There's a hole in the wing, there's fuel gushing out of the wing, and the engine is in a bad state.
Despite all this chaos in the cockpit, the captain was unbelievably calm.
I do apologise. I'm sure you are aware we have a technical issue with our number 2 engine. We have dealt with the situation at the moment. The aircraft is secure at this stage, and as we progress with this, we'll keep you informed. At this stage, everything is secure. The aircraft is flying safely, and we'll get back to you very shortly with further information. Thank you for your patience.
As more checks came up, you started to question how many systems will I have left? Has a whole aircraft failed?
20 Centre. We have emergency services on standby.
Qantas 3-2, we were required to hold for at least another 30 minutes before making an approach.
Qantas 3-2, roger, you are priority traffic. Report ready for the approach.
I'm sure you are aware we're not proceeding to Sydney at this stage. We're making our left turn now to track back towards Singapore. We're going to have to hold for some time whilst we do lighten our load by dumping some fuel and a number of checklists we have to perform.
I thought, let's protect this aircraft at the most basic level possible, and that was to position it within gliding range of Singapore, and that's what we did.
At speeds of over 400 kilometres an hour, and with the automatic brake systems failing, Richard made the emergency landing at Changi Airport.
And we're onto the ground.
He had to use manual foot brakes to stop the aircraft. But the drama was far from over. Fuel was leaking onto the tarmac. Passengers were kept on board while the plane was hosed down and electricals disconnected.
When we landed, we were kind of kept in the plane for an extra hour and a half, so we were kind of stuck in the sweltering heat, and there were kids crying, and, you know, I was getting like a sauna there.
Miraculously, not a single person on the ground or in the air suffered a serious injury.
Cheers.
Passengers toasted the skills of the captain and crew.
Could have been catastrophic. We could have been not talking today.
I was proud to be in command of that aircraft.
Australia's commercial airlines remain among the safest in the world. And in recent years, her rail and road systems have become more sophisticated. There's been a huge push to make all highways dual carriageways.
The roads are in a very unforgiving environment. As they duplicate more roads and improve the roads, you've got to get on to educating the drivers, both the heavy vehicle drivers and the guys who just drive the motor cars with their families, and it just gets harder as there gets to be more on the road.
And while train travel may become safer as the first driverless trains are brought into the metro lines, the fact remains that there are tens of thousands of kilometres of track for governments to maintain, while safety systems can be easily affected by human error.
You're always going to have the situation like Kang, where humans will be humans. And generally, when humans are being humans, it's never a great thing.